Okay, so today we're going to be talking about intellectual property. And what intellectual property is, it's the right to produce as a monopolist for some period of time. Some forms of intellectual property are trade secrets, copyrights, patents, or what I call authenticity rents, which are, even though you don't have a formal intellectual property protection, there are people who really want to have an original. Like, a lot of artists have that. There's like a value to the authentic, even if you don't have an official right to exclude people. And this is one of the oldest tools of economic policy. I had a quote that was discovered by a Greek historian who's a friend of mine, published on the back cover of the Journal of Political Economy, describing how in 7th century Greece they gave exclusive rights to produce a dish if you produced a really delicious dish for a festival that they had. So today we're going to learn about some of the trade-offs associated with intellectual property and the relationship of these to the punishment of crime. We'll start by talking about what monopoly profits incentivize the creation of, about the importance of dynamics in markets and creative destruction. We'll then talk about the dynamic and static effects of crime and derive from that the optimal enforcement of law. We'll then relate that to intellectual property and talk about the innovation incentives and the trade-off between those and the ex post distortions created by intellectual property. We'll then discuss a model of optimal intellectual property protection, talk about some comparative statics and lessons for policy, and then give some broader perspectives. So far, we've viewed monopoly profits as a transfer, and therefore we've thought of them as benign or really neutral from the perspective of total welfare. But monopoly rents are really crucial to encourage various different activities. So while some monopoly profits really are just rents to individuals, they also can encourage a number of activities that have a significant elasticity. In this case, we should view them more as prices for activities and less as just rents. Now, some of these activities are just purely rent-seeking, in which case monopoly profits become deadweight loss. But sometimes monopoly profits can encourage the creation of new markets. And because the monopolist only captures profit and not consumer surplus, in this case there can be a large positive externality associated with the creation of these markets. And therefore monopoly profits may actually create more positive benefit than the firm is able to capture. And it can therefore be very beneficial to incentivize people to create such markets. Now, in some cases, monopoly profits can encourage destructive activities. In that case, monopoly rents are not just a loss of the area of the monopoly rent, but even a greater loss than that. So really crucial to understanding the effects of monopoly is not just the static deadweight loss, but thinking about what it is that monopoly encourages people to do. Okay. And this is particularly important because often profits are greater than deadweight loss. And this is true under standard monopoly for some types of demand. But it's also true, it's even more true in broader cases like oligopoly, where it's often the case that profits are much larger than the deadweight loss, because the deadweight loss grows like a triangle. So as long as the monopoly power isn't too great, that triangle will be relatively small, whereas the profits grow like a rectangle and therefore will tend to be larger. Okay. So we talked about briefly about ways of getting monopolies, and those included protection by the government, such as licensure and chartered corporations. And this can be socially useful if it's just for importing or exporting, because the nation may want to use that monopoly to extract more rents from other countries. Private and illegal violence is another way of creating a monopoly. Exclusionary practices may have some similar impacts, as we talked about. There can be illegal collusion or mergers to form a cartel. Antitrust laws try to prevent this, but it still occurs quite frequently. So about 10 years ago, there was a big collusion racket that was discovered in the vitamin industry, and this was profiled in a movie with Matt Damon that I'm trying to remember. I think it's called like The Insider or something like that. The mergers can also create monopolies, and the government reviews these but doesn't always catch things. And in some countries, the government doesn't review it at all. So in Peru, I was trying to work on creating antitrust policy, merger policy, but there really is very little. And in Peru, when they had free trade with the United States, I think I mentioned to you guys, the U.S. investors came and bought up all the beer in Peru and cartelized the industry. Another final way is intellectual property. So let's try to think about what each of these things encourages beyond the static distortion that it creates. Does someone want to talk about what some of these things might encourage? Yeah, Vidar.
So the violence, in order to get monopolies for violence, like with the drug cartels, encourages increased use of violence.
Yeah, and killing lots of people, right? Protection by the government can encourage lobbying and corruption of politicians. Largely that's waste, but it might also corrode the political system. But it's not always bad. So for example, sometimes in order to lobby, firms need to make the public sympathetic to them, right? And often to do that, they might do some charitable activity, they might do some research. AT&T, because they were a regulated monopoly, did a lot of research in order to win the sympathy of the public for supporting its goals. And even bribing politicians, maybe that's not as bad as it might sound, because those politicians need to be paid by somebody. In order to encourage good people to go into politics, you would want their salaries to be higher. It's not obvious that that's such a terrible thing, and in fact, even donations to their campaigns, some of that's probably wasteful, but somebody needs to fund those campaigns, and we don't have a good system of public financing in the United States. So that might not be terrible. Private or illegal violence is almost certainly destructive. Illegal cartels may encourage people to waste some money on enforcing those cartels illegally, but otherwise it's quite similar to a merger. Mergers, if we give incentive for those, they might in principle give incentives for people to merge even when there are diseconomies of scale. They might also encourage people to enter into an industry, to compete with an existing firm, even if that's costly, just so that they can get bought out by the firm through a merger. And there was a previous problem set that, previous year's problem set that had you guys look at that stuff. And finally, intellectual property encourages people to create new products, and we'll stress some of the benefits of that, but it can also have disadvantages. So for example, if somebody is coming up with a product that they know someone else will come up with anyways, and they're just trying to beat them to it so they can get the patent, that's not so beneficial, right? Now, Joseph Schumpeter emphasized the importance of these dynamics. In particular, he thought that what really mattered to the economy was innovation and progress, and that the static distortions that we were focused on before for monopoly are relatively small. They reduce quantities, sure, but the real important thing is that the economy is constantly innovating. And so we should really be focused on not these static distortions, but rather what types of firms are created, what sorts of innovations are encouraged, etc. Now, I think you have to be a little bit careful about this because, of course, the reason why innovation seems so much more important is that these are things that matter in the long run to the economy. Once you take into account discounting, maybe they're not quite as much overwhelmingly more important. But if you think of it in the broad scheme of things, innovation created, a modern capitalist economy, whereas the static distortions just reduce by a little bit the output of that economy, right? And the modern capitalist economy, increased the income of the world by many orders of magnitude, not just 20% or something like that, right? So the biggest industrial issues come in the process of competition. And how was it that Schumpeter described the process of competition, Russell?
That as more productive firms enter, the old, less productive firms exit. The process of increasing innovation.
Yeah, and in particular, he described that the old monopolies' biggest threat is not competition from people similar to them, but rather that someone new comes and completely destroys the relevance of the industry that they exist in, right? And so you could be a comfortable monopolist of one particular technology, but someone could come in with a completely different technology and wipe out that whole area, right? And so the most important goal is to try to, he argued, is to try to encourage this sort of creative destruction. And this may require concentration in order to encourage R&D. So even though we might dislike monopoly, in order to incentivize R&D, which is so important to the economy, we might have to allow for that types of concentration, because the whole reason that people innovate is in the hopes of some temporary monopoly power, even though they know that someone else will come along later and supersede them. So Schumpeter argued that industrial policy should really be focused on thinking about when new products are created rather than the static distortion, and that we should only eliminate the static distortion if and when it promotes this goal of encouraging the right types of innovation. And I think that this Schumpeterian idea resonates pretty well with high-tech industries. So Facebook came in and really didn't just compete a little bit along the edges, but wiped out all the social networks that came before. Apple has repeatedly introduced new products that have created new industries, really, not just new products within, not just slight upgrades to their existing products, though in recent years that's been less true. Google has similarly opened up whole new market segments. And it was, in fact, a latecomer to the search market, but it came to dominate it within a few years, and then it opened up MapQuest had existed, but they really totally changed the online maps market. They changed the academic world by creating Google Scholar. They changed how libraries work with Google Books, etc. And of course, Google has established a dominant position this way, but I think most people think it's much better to have Google being a monopoly than not to have had all those huge changes in the marketplace that have done so much for society. In fact, Google's monopoly position and whatever excess advertising or et cetera, that we've had to put up with as a result seem really small inconveniences compared to the whole products and markets that it's created. Yeah, Tova.
Does Google have a lot of patents? No. Do they have any intellectual property rights?
Oh yeah, they've got tons. I mean, that plays an important role in their market dominance. I mean, I don't think it's the only exclusive role, but it certainly plays an important role.
The whole reason they bought Motorola mostly was to buy their patents.
Yeah, exactly. Smartphones seem to have a different business model every 6 months. That's been slowing down a little bit, but during the early years of smartphones, it's like every generation of smartphones seemed like a completely different world than the generation before them. Now, This is less clear in other industries. Even operating systems have been pretty static for quite a while. But now, yeah, Oliver.
I just wanted to ask, is there any, like, I guess, modern formal kind of economic models to try to capture that idea of a Schumpeterian process?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in macro especially. Like there's this stuff in the endogenous growth literature that's all about that. Philippe Aghion is very famous for working on that. Good question though. Okay, so I think to sort of illustrate some of the importance of these dynamics, I think a nice analogy is to think about crime. So most criminal activity is committed by the poor rather than the rich. And there's a famous quote from Anatole France about this that inspired my wife's dissertation, actually, which if you're interested in hearing about, she's giving a job talk here, actually, 2 weeks from tomorrow in the political science department. So this quote says, "The law in its majestic equality forbids the poor and rich man equally from sleeping underneath a bridge." And the thing is that most of the things that the law makes illegal are things that the poor would want to do and the rich wouldn't want to do, right? And so as a result, most criminal activity is redistributive from the poor to the rich. And if the poor have greater marginal utility of wealth, that's actually a good thing, right? And, you know, in some sense, theft doesn't need to involve much efficiency loss. It's just redistribution. In fact, most efficiency loss of crime comes from attempts to stop crime, the violence in the process of that, right? And so from a static perspective, crime is great.
Not like all crime.
What? Not all crime, but most standard property crime is good from a static perspective.
Within limits, right? If you have, like, if no property law existed, then people wouldn't, you'd have this.
Well, wait a second. But of course, this is an absurd conclusion, and so when we come to an absurd conclusion, we need to re-examine the premises that led us to there. And the key thing, I think, is what are the long-term and dynamic effects of crime? Actually, I had a problem set in a previous year that had you guys actually explore in such stuff related to my wife's dissertation, actually, whether it's so absurd to think that allowing some crime might not be bad. But of course, you know, in general, we think crime is bad. And if crime is illegal because it would encourage people to waste a lot of resources on becoming criminals rather than being productive. And as Tova was getting at, if you had no security for property, people would waste a lot of money on trying to prevent other people from stealing. And it would discourage work probably more than would be optimal in optimal redistribution. But of course, none of these effects show up in the simple static analysis because they're all about long-term incentive effects of doing this stuff. Similarly, the standard static analysis of industrial organization is incredibly naive because it only thinks about these very short-term distortions to the quantity and not about the longer-term incentive effects, right? And so you can't really have a theory of crime without dynamics. And in the same way, Schumpeter would argue you can't really have a theory of innovation and of a healthy industrial economy without having without having dynamics as well. And in fact, without dynamics, we can't rationalize most policies that we take towards the industrial economy. So while we should keep static effects in mind, I think they're really only the beginning. The deadweight loss triangle should not be the only thing that we think about when we think about industrial policy, as it often becomes. And in fact, the similarities between IO and crime are broader. And the reason is that in crime, the problem we face is that we have to punish people rather than just charging them fines. Now, if you just charge someone a fine, you just take from the person you fine and you give to the government. So the fine itself is not costly, right? It's just a way of encouraging behavior. But in crime, when we're forced to punish people, the punishment that we inflict on them is not only not a benefit to us, it's a harm to us because it costs money to run the prisons, it costs money to inflict the punishments. Similarly, with intellectual property, we don't just give a prize to the person who creates intellectual property. We create a static deadweight loss in order to reward people, right? And so there's a very similar thing between crime and intellectual property, which is that there are losses to society in the process of giving that reward, just as there are losses to society in the process of giving the punishment that accompanies crime.
But some
Yeah,
people
Albert.
pay for the fine is too large, so you need punishment for that.
Exactly. So that's the reason why we have to do that. Exactly. Okay. So I think it's therefore useful to start, before we go into intellectual property, with the more vivid model of crime that Becker proposed, because crime is sort of a fun topic. So imagine we have crimes, and each crime causes a harm H and receives a punishment P. Then we can think of there being a demand for offenses, which is like the number of offenses that will occur if the punishment is P. And therefore we can think of there being a surplus to the offenders, right? If they would still be willing to do it even at this punishment, then they're getting some benefit, obviously, from the crime. And we can just add that up using the standard surplus formula. And imagine that administering punishments costs an amount C of P per offense that occurs. So then there are two sources of inefficiency coming from the punishment. One is that the punishment hurts the criminal directly but doesn't benefit society. And the second is it imposes a cost of punishing C of P on society. So our goal is to choose the level of punishment to maximize the surplus to the offenders minus the cost to society of their offenses, which is the direct externality created by those plus the cost of enforcement multiplied by the number of offenses that occur. Okay. So if we take the derivative of this whole thing, we're going to get negative the number of offenses, because that's the standard envelope theorem harm to the criminals, minus the change in the number of offenses, minus the change in the cost multiplied by the number of offenses currently occurring. So we can then arrange all these things to group together the terms that are proportional to the offenses and the terms proportional to the derivative of the offenses. And this yields Becker's famous formula, which is that the elasticity of crime with respect to punishment should be multiplied by the ratio of harm to the amount of punishment. So that's the harm of crime, which is both the fact that you're going to have to punish that crime divided by the amount of punishment is equal to the marginal cost of punishing, which is the cost directly inflicted on the people who are punished, multiplied by the derivative of the cost of punishment with respect to the amount of the punishment. Okay, so this gives us that enforcement should be greater under what circumstances, Winnie? What are features of the environment that would make us want to enforce more?
We need to upwardly adjust P punishment if harm is greater.
If harm is greater, absolutely. Because that will make the left-hand side, which is sort of the benefits, greater. What are other things that would...
Cost is lower.
If-
Responsiveness.
Yeah, and if the responsiveness is higher, absolutely.
Just to be clear.
Yeah.
You mean minimize the surplus minus cost? Not much.
No, maximize. We want to maximize the benefits that criminals get from the crimes that they commit, subject to, minus the cost that it creates for society. Right? We don't want to punish so much that if someone really, really wants to commit a crime and it's incredibly valuable for them, that they can't do it. Right? And at least in principle. Okay, so this theory helps guide much of thinking about criminal justice. So for example, what is the idea that punishment should be larger for more harmful offenses? What in standard criminal justice logic does that correspond to? Yebin?
So when the harm of the crime is really high, the punishment should be high.
Yeah, that's just literally saying what I just said. But what in normal thinking about criminal justice, what does that correspond to? There's a famous phrase that corresponds to this. If you do more harm, you should be punished more. Or just give an example from, like, what are two crimes and how does their punishment correspond to?
Like murder,
Yeah, versus
like stealing, which is
stealing gets a lot less punishment, right? Because it's less harmful, right? I mean, the famous phrase is the punishment should fit the crime, right? Which is based exactly on this idea. But another point is that actually, if it's harder to catch someone doing a particular crime, you should also punish them more. Because the amount of harm that's going to occur for every time that you end up catching someone is going to be greater, right? So you should divide by the probability with which the person gets caught. You have it there.
Would that be the justification for using the sheriff using a lot of force against Robin Hood? Because I was following my head, and it seems everything else, the maximizing the benefit to the community and all of that, would be very positive for Robin Hood.
Yeah.
But then that would justify why the sheriff.
Because the harm is greater?
No, because the problem, like he keeps.
Oh, because he's more talented. Yeah, the more talented a criminal is, the more you should punish them. So that's another, we'll talk about another reason why you might want to punish premeditated murders more, but another reason is that it's harder to catch a premeditated murderer, right? Because they have had time to think about how to escape. Also, you want to avoid and reduce very costly punishments, and you want to do more of punishments that are less costly. So what does Becker say that implies? Luke, Jane?
I think he means that if a crime is hard to catch or costly to catch, you should increase the costs of doing that action so that like the expected value of doing that crime is very high. So it's like you deter criminals in that way.
That's right. But also he says that we should try to do types of punishment that are less costly. What examples does he give of that?
Does he use fines, I think?
So that absolutely, he thinks fines are the best, but if we can't do fines, what does he say?
If we can't do fines, then I'm not too sure.
So he says corporal punishment.
Like prisons?
No, corporal punishment, like beating people up rather than putting them in prison, because it's costly to put them in prison, right? We also should punish less in situations where people are less elastic. And what are some things in criminal justice that might correspond to that? Arvid?
Like crimes of passion, like where you're just suddenly enraged and like you're not thought it out, you just go in, like at that point you just don't care about the consequences, or like when
Exactly.
you're really young and
Yeah.
you don't really care about the future.
Or you're temporarily insane. You know, those are all cases where we think that the person, like the threat of the punishment is not going to be that effective, so it's sort of waste to put that person in jail for having done it. Okay. So the elasticity, we talked a little bit about this in the price discrimination lecture as well, right? So elasticity matters because it's wasteful to punish. Otherwise, elasticity wouldn't matter, right? We would just set the punishment equal to whatever the harm was. The elasticity would be irrelevant if it weren't the case that punishment was wasteful. Otherwise, we would just be Pigouvian, right? Now, IP is similar but reversed. And Lancelot, could you give some intuition for that?
Like this, you know, reversed. Well, I guess you would want to, in a Pigouvian world, you would want to let the firm get the whole surplus of the whole social surplus of what they put
Yes.
to like incentivize perfectly. And in this case, you don't want to do this because there is that loss from the monopoly power.
Exactly.
So you want to
And so then what?
take into account elasticity, take into account like how much it incentivizes the firm.
Exactly. What's the elasticity of innovation with respect to? Exactly. So creating new products brings social benefits, and it's always going to be greater than the profits the firm earns because they don't capture the inframarginal consumer surplus, though you could get closer with price discrimination. but rewarding via market power is wasteful because it creates deadweight loss. So IP should, the IP trade-off should resemble exactly the Becker thing, but on the reward side rather than the negative side. And therefore IP protection should be greater if the supply of innovations is more elastic to monetary rewards, as well as if the social benefit of innovation is larger relative to the rewards that firms receive. And if the deadweight loss, the marginal deadweight loss, that's sort of the cost of rewarding, is greater. Yeah.
I'm just trying to think of examples of this, right? So you might imagine that when you're programming, it's like, I guess, easier to innovate with new code than it is with neutrons or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's an argument that we'll talk about later. But that's definitely something people have tried to think about, is like areas where the elasticity of innovation supply might be lower or greater. Yes, Ad?
Wouldn't it be hard to figure out kind of like a priority whether or not the innovation would have these social benefits, like a greater social benefit than instead of those two?
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about that in a little bit. That's, I think, an important reason why we have to use this deadweight loss stuff rather than giving a prize. If we knew how valuable an innovation would be, then we would give a prize. So here it's an informational problem rather than a problem that like we can't find someone who already has no money. That means that we that we have to use deadweight loss. Yeah, Donnie.
Isn't there the opposite problem that if it's if the benefit is large, but it would be generated irrespective of whether or not you awarded it in this fashion, and it creates a lot of problems, like the patent system.
Well, that's really an elasticity issue, right? If it would be created irrespective, then there's no elasticity with respect to the. So it's very related, right? It's saying there's no elasticity of the actual innovations that get created with respect to the rewards. And if it's more costly, you're right. Yeah. So all those things factor in. Okay, so if there's more IP protection, there's going to be more deadweight loss, but it also brings more benefits from innovation. And an important thing to think about is that if we start raising the price from 0 to just a little bit, that's not going to bring very much deadweight loss, right? Because the deadweight loss is a triangle, right? On the other hand, as we get towards the monopoly optimum, right, then the marginal deadweight loss is going to be large because the triangle will have gotten thick, but the marginal profits is going to be very small because the monopolist doesn't really care as long as it's close to the optimum for him. And so what that says is that optimal IP protection is always going to be partial because, the first little bit is really worth it and the last bit is really not worth it. And the question is where we're going to settle at in between, and that'll depend on the trade-off of the costs and the benefits. So Lancelot, what are the costs of IP protection? In addition to, just think of all the ones you can think of, not just... So there's a reduced quantity deadweight loss, but what else can you think of?
Is there like something with like there is a race between like companies to like invent the thing?
So that's true. That's true.
I don't know if you can call it rent-seeking.
But just think in your own life, like what do you hear people bitching about IP?
Yeah. Well, for instance, like in developing countries, it would be useful to produce.
That's basically the standard deadweight loss, right? But
okay, yeah, that's true. But also, like you want to incentivize the things for which there is a big market. But I guess that would be efficient because people don't have.
Maybe, yeah. It depends. Depends on how much externalities there are and so forth. But
other problem might be. Well, there's a.
I mean, it's just an inefficiently run system, right? Like there's all these lawsuits and so forth, right? And like it discourages other people from building on top of the ideas, which is sort of like the static deadweight loss, but it's also a little bit different, right?
Different layers.
Yeah. Robert, where's Robert? Is he here? Yeah. Well, so the benefits, right, are that it gives incentives to innovate, and another important benefit is it gives formal IP gives people a reason to disclose what they've invented rather than keeping it as a trade secret. So that's an important reason for intellectual property. Okay, so let me give you some evidence on this. This is actually a 2013 paper, not 2011. we just saw this presented. So, okay, so what this shows is in order to get a drug approved, you need to put it through an FDA process, right? You need to go through all of these trials and so forth. It's much, much easier to get it approved quickly if people are dying very frequently, if absent the drug, because you can see an impact on mortality much more quickly. Whereas if it takes a long time for people to, die, then it takes a long time to figure out whether the drug is effective or not. So when the 5-year survival rate is really, really low, that means that people are dying really quickly. When the 5-year survival rate on a type of cancer is high, then people are not dying very frequently, right? And as a result of that, because when something takes a long time to get approved, you're obviously going to earn lower profits on it because you'll have your patent for less long, and you'll just have to wait longer to get the profits. And what you see is that there's a lot more trials on stuff with a longer, shorter wait to get the stuff approved than there is on stuff that has a longer wait to get approved. And that's some fairly strong evidence that the more profits you make, the more people are likely to innovate on the area. Yeah, nice slide.
The trial is part of your patent regime?
It is, yeah.
You get the patent before the trial?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's what this paper is about.
Yeah.
Well,
Change that system?
that's very complicated. I mean, this paper sort of seems to be pointing in that direction a little bit, but you have to think about like all the other parameters that go into optimal patent life and whether those are correlated or not. You see what I mean? And that's not at all obvious, so.
Yes. So did you find this persuasive when Heidi presented it a few weeks ago, or?
I didn't find it at all persuasive on the point that Lancelot was getting at, but I found it very persuasive as evidence of a measure of the elasticity of innovation supply.
You find it persuasive because it informs your pre-existing beliefs?
I found it persuasive because I thought it was really clean evidence. I mean, I thought it was one of the only clean things I'd ever seen people do on this topic.
So not that clean, like the disease or the kind of cancers that get people to die faster might be correlated with other things that like we need to do. We need to pay for people for those drugs, and so we need to be incentive for people to innovate. Right?
Yeah, but that's the whole.
If I have a higher willingness to pay for something that's going to get me to die like very soon, so maybe there is like a more elastic market and a higher incentive to innovate in that market.
Well, but I mean, look, I think they do some nice things to proxy for the demand in the markets and so forth. So, yeah. Oliver, what did you find unpersuasive about it?
I don't actually remember any details, so I can give you a...
No, I mean, I think that the only thing is I'd really like them to get the actual number. Like, what I'm most interested in out of that paper is the elasticity of innovation supply, because I think it's a crucial parameter, and they didn't really get that number nailed down yet. But hopefully they will soon. On the other hand, Heidi has other work on the costs of intellectual property, and she shows that basically, so there were all these genes that during the Human Genome Project were discovered. Some of them were discovered by Celera, which was a private company that was working on it, and they were all patented. Some of them were discovered by the public project, and they were all put into the public domain. And then she looks at how much innovation building on that stuff occurred, and she finds that the ones that were in the public domain, there was like a lot more innovation building on it, and the stuff that was discovered by the private company, a lot less because it was patented. And so that was a pretty persuasive evidence that there were these costs to the diffusion of ideas. So there was less citations, there was less drugs built on top of them, etc. Okay. So now I just want to focus on the consumption distortion versus the investment incentives. And in particular, let's consider a model where each innovation creates a new market, a new product, which has a new market, and the products have no marginal costs of production. Like most intellectual goods, they're free to copy. And they all have the same, let's say on average, they all have the same demand function. And let's normalize this demand function at a price of 0 to have a quantity of 1. And to have a monopoly price of 1. So then the consumer surplus created is going to be given by the standard formula. The firm will earn profits of P times Q of P. And innovations are now going to be costly to produce. And what are some of the reasons that innovations would be costly to produce, Kevin?
I mean, I guess it just takes capital to make R&D departments that would make innovations. It takes manpower, I guess, to innovate things.
Yeah, so people have an opportunity cost of their time. It takes capital to run the experiments, to figure things out. And in particular, most innovations don't turn out. So in order for someone to spend valuable time that they could be for certain earning money at, and instead spend it like thinking about ideas, they better have some prospect of making a lot of money coming out of that, right? So this leads to a supply of innovations as a function of the profits that you earn from innovating. And total welfare is going to be consumer surplus from the innovation plus the producer surplus. And Lucas,
Yes.
what will that be in this context?
So in this case, we will have the total welfare equal to the supply of the innovations. If we assume that the profits are constant across the supply, the supply of the products multiplied by profits plus consumer surplus as a function of profits, which presumably would be decreasing in profits.
Well, okay, so let's say we've got a particular price. We know what profits are as a function of price. We know what consumer surplus is as a function of price. We know how many innovations we get. So what is going to be the benefit to consumers?
To just consumers?
Yeah, let's just focus on the consumers first.
Sure. So consumer surplus is function of price. Okay. And if we're assuming that the firms pick the correct price.
No, the price is set by the government. This is like measuring the degree of intellectual property.
Yeah. I mean, you just do the integral for the consumer surplus.
Yeah, so it's there, but then you have to multiply it by the number of innovations that are created.
Yeah, absolutely.
SFP. Okay. Now, what about the benefits to the firms of creating the innovations? Because remember, they have costs.
Yeah.
And so how do we derive that from the supply function for innovations?
So, the profit is net of cost?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So then it'd be, you got a distribution of firms' costs to innovate?
And I've summarized that by a supply function.
Sure.
So how can we derive the benefits to the firms from that supply function?
So this is profit now net of the cost of innovation?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So then it's just the sum, or no, it's supply as a function of profit, so it's just integrate.
Exactly.
Over the supply.
You do the normal thing where you integrate under the supply function, right? So that's the integral from profits of 0 to profits that you get for P of the supply function as a function of profits, right? Okay, so let's now take the first order condition for this. Lancelot, can you do that? Maybe on the board would be best.
From the thing to the pointer.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I take your choke?
Yeah, yeah. And is there a eraser? Here you go.
So what am I choosing? P?
You're choosing P.
Why is supply a function of profits and not profits a function of innovation?
Because the profits are what encouraged people to provide the innovations. I mean, the idea is we're thinking that there's a bunch of innovations you might create. Each creates an identical market. And so, yes, in the market, eventually there will be some, supply and demand and so forth. But we're looking at the market for creating the innovations. No.
like differs best for the social planning thing, or if they choose the price?
Yeah, so the idea is that social planner, by like choosing the degree of intellectual property protection, is sort of choosing like how high the price is going to be. That's the way of thinking about it.
Is this within be represented like by years, like in the province, then by increasing years or like increasing years, like get at that?
It's probably better thought of as like the scope of patent protection or something like that. But you could think of it in terms of years. The problem is then it's not that clear that could be like linear. You know what I mean? Not like it could be that they choose the full monopoly price for all of the years and then everything is so.
Is that it?
How do you get this term?
Is that like the Leibniz rule?
Yes, let me think.
There's no P.
No, this is just an integrating variable. There's no P there.
I guess I get it a bit.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. So you get S prime pi prime times CS. You've got S times CS prime. Yep, that looks good. Okay, I'll take it from there. Nice job, Lancelot. Good. So here's what Lancelot had, and then we can define the total surplus that we get for a given price minus the consumer surplus we would get if the price was zero, because at price of zero there's no profits, as the deadweight loss. And then notice that the marginal deadweight loss is the derivative of consumer surplus minus the negative of the derivative of consumer surplus plus the derivative of profits. So we can rewrite this whole thing as derivative of profits with respect to price times the slope of the supply multiplied by consumer surplus. So these are the additional innovations we get multiplied by the external benefit that they bring. And we have to set that equal to how much deadweight loss changes on all the things that are already being supplied. Right? So that's a pretty simple trade-off. And this leads to another central elasticity here, like in the Becker problem, which is that the elasticity of innovation supply multiplied by the ratio of the external benefit of consumer surplus to the profits that the firm receives is equal to the ratio of the marginal deadweight loss divided by the marginal profits. And this suggests that we should have higher protection of innovation. Is Alexander here? I don't think he is. No. Under what circumstances? Can somebody? Yeah, Miles.
So if there's higher elasticity, or the profits are higher compared to whatever the distortion you're creating.
Yeah, that's right. So if there's higher elasticity, more marginal profits for every unit of dead weight loss, and we can try this out with some simple demand forms. Remember that the ratio of deadweight loss to profits is approximately the pass-through rate. So a natural thing to vary is the pass-through rate. So for example, if we use a constant pass-through demand class that includes constant elasticity, exponential, and linear, that has this form. So this basically includes all the standard demand forms you use, and the reason is that this is the thing that gives linear solutions to problems and therefore is easy to solve. And the evidence on elasticity of innovation supply is relatively thin, but I think at least in many cases it shows that it's between 0.5 and 1, though in the drug example I was trying to elicit a number from Heidi and so forth. It seems like it's closer to being 3 in that case. These numbers tend to come from high-tech settings. So that's consistent with Oliver's discussion. Evidence on pass-through is a lot weaker, but maybe 0.5 to 2 is a reasonable range. And this helps get us at the optimal protection range. So on the left, what I've done is increase the pass-through rate. That increases both sides of this equation because it increases the CS to pi ratio, but it also increases the marginal deadweight loss to marginal profits ratio turns out that the overall effect of moving from the lower curves to the higher curves is to decrease the optimal protection. On the other hand, if I increase elasticity of innovation supply, that just clearly increases the optimal protection. And that gives us, turns out that over the range of the things I considered, optimal protection goes from about 0.45, depending on the case, to about 0.6 or 0.765. So the question is, how would we match this up in practice? Imagine we thought of this in terms of the life of a patent. Miles, how would you match this up with practical things?
You look at sort of what the actual term is, comparing that to what sort of what the, so given them the rate that we discounted back and the elasticity.
Yeah.
Just see if it sort of lies within.
So the point is that the total life is not really infinite because of discounting. So really discounting means that like total life is like 30 years or something like that. And then the question is, what is the life that we actually have people get as a fraction of that, what is the effective life as a fraction of that? So US patent length is about 20 years, and assuming a 5% income interest rate, that gives us about that, this is going to be 1 minus 0.95 to the 20. That's like what fraction of the total life is captured by the life during that time, and that's about 0.64, which is about what we calculated, right? So 20 years is not too far off from this simple calibration of what optimal life should be.
What did you, what number did you use for elasticity?
I was using, well, I traced out here that over the full range of different things that we said were reasonable, you would get between 0.45 and 0.65.
But you said that they found another estimated.
Yeah, so if elasticity were up at 3, then probably you should have about 30 or 40 years there. I mean, I'd have to do the calculation, but yeah.
So this is the elasticity of supply with respect to profit?
Yeah, exactly. So in principle, we should take into account other harms and benefits, and you could throw those into the deadweight loss prime and the benefit of disclosure into the CS over pi ratio. Now, unlike the standard practice in the US, you would think this should differ by industry because of the possible differences in elasticity. Some of this might occur through enforcement, but this is less developed than in other areas of law enforcement. There's not as good of an understanding among judges of what areas would have higher or lower elasticity. But some have argued that the tech sector should have shorter patent lives for this reason, and that pharmaceuticals should have more. Okay. So this is the basic trade-off, but there are many other tools that we have for encouraging innovations. So for example, we can give subsidies for research and development, and this is done pretty extensively in the United States, tax credits, National Science Foundation. Also, private firms can get good PR from having labs that contribute to basic science. We could also give incentives rather than by patents, by buyouts, by the government. Government can buy out patents, put them into public domain, or give prizes, which is kind of similar. And this is historically popular. During the 19th century, a lot of innovation incentives came through governments like the French and British government offering prizes for various types of innovations. X Prizes is trying to do this again these days. You can also give subsidies for purchasing innovative products to people. So for example, a lot of people advocate subsidies for green technology, not just because we want to reduce carbon use now, but because it will encourage people to develop things so they can sell it into that market. There's also trade-offs between the length and the breadth of patents. There's also the design of criteria for when you allow a patent. So there's these criteria called novelty, usefulness, and non-obviousness. In order to get a patent, the thing that you propose has to be not obvious. It has to be directly useful, and it has to be novel. And there's discussions of how exactly you should interpret those criteria and why. There's also issues of like imagine you develop one innovation and then someone else develops something else that builds on that. How should the value created by those two things in the market be split between the two innovators? And what's the right way to use patent pools or industrial policy to trade those things off? And there's trade-offs in each of these areas. So the benefits of research and development subsidies are that they help internalize some of that inframarginal consumer surplus that's never going to be captured into profits. But the cost is that it redistributes to entrepreneurs and away from the rest of the public, which might not be good. And I think the overall gain from introducing this additional tool is you're able to separate the targeting of rewards to different areas from the issue of distribution, redistribution. So if you have this in addition to, say, a corporate tax, you can separate how you target innovations in different areas of the economy from just the overall transfers between firms and consumers. My job market paper was about the trade-off between innovation between IP and prizes or subsidies. So this gets back to, whose question was it earlier? Someone asked, Saad's question maybe, he said, Adam Smith in the lectures on jurisprudence said that there's really no way that a legislature could ever come up with such a good way of determining what the prize should be for a product as intellectual property. Because intellectual property means that you only get a reward if people are willing to pay for the thing, and you never get a reward if they're not, right? And my job market paper tried to think about that trade-off, that maybe we only need the distortion that comes with intellectual property in cases where the government doesn't have a good sense of what the value of the product is. And we tried to look at that. We also, a former student, an undergraduate student actually, looked at that in his thesis in mobile apps markets, whether you should allow people to charge something which like reduces the number of people who get to use the app, or whether you should just give a payment directly. Apple should give a payment directly based on what it can learn, and that depends on how well Apple can predict how valuable something will be. Yeah, Luke.
Has there been any examples of countries saying, you get it on the market for a year, we look at how you did that year, and then we give you a prize based on that?
So that's a really interesting idea, a really interesting extension of this. But the problem with that is that then you might have like a really strong incentive during that year to like try to do things to prop up demand, because it's not. You see what I mean? Another problem with that.
Suggestion?
What?
What was the suggestion?
That like you like let it have a monopoly for 1 year, and then you base the future prices on that.
Or you could collude or something like
Yeah, exactly, with the consumers. Another problem with that is that there might be some like late blooming and some early blooming products. So like the FDA thing was a perfect example of that, right? Those have no sales during the first year. So you clearly couldn't base it on that. So
But you could reduce the bit and length though.
you could. No. So I'm almost sure that like you'll want to do some of what you're saying, Luke. It's just you might not want to do it for too short of a period.
And there's clearly a risk of gaming.
Yeah. Yeah, Tova.
I think I did work in the tech sector over the summer, and
Yeah.
the incentive structure now is to do just that, because when you're presenting to VCs, if you're innovating, you want to show like short-term profits.
Yeah.
And so the emphasis is on like very poorly built software that's
Yeah.
super flashy and really, really well selling.
Yeah.
That has like, almost no long-term potential.
Because people will learn how bad it is. Yeah.
And it also depends on like the country and the like specific area, but like this is exactly.
Yeah, so that's an example of someone trying to implement a scheme a little bit like what you're saying, Luke. You know what I mean? And it's got a problem. So there's also trade-offs of length versus breadth. So some people have argued that you should have very, very thin patents that last a very long time, because they do the minimum amount of distortion during the period that they're there, and then you just extend it for infinite. So that's an argument that's been made. Another issue is the division between sequential innovations. Patent pooling can reduce the deadweight loss on sequential innovations by making sure you don't get charged a little bit for each of the products, but then the patent pool has to decide how to divide it among the different things, and that should be done based basically on the elasticities, right? A lot of these issues are still open, especially the issues about how to interpret the criteria of non-obviousness, usefulness, and like what's the right economic basis for those ideas. So that's still an open question. Great.